Today we are continuing with the thread that we started in the last class of tutorials on tools that one can use for conducting studies with human subjects. So today we'll be hearing from Sugandha, and she will describe a platform that's increasingly, well, it's already very popular for conducting studies online with human participants. It's Amazon's Mechanical Turk platform, or MTurk for short. My lab has used it in the past, and many other labs do, and it has the advantage of giving you a lot of data very quickly, because you're essentially broadcasting your experiment to the wide world and inviting people to come be participants. So whereas a study in the lab with, say, 20 or 30 subjects might take a whole semester, on MTurk, we've often found that the study, you can collect all of the data in a matter of a couple of days. So one certainly has to keep in mind some of the caveats in working with an online platform, but it also has significant advantages, and especially in the current circumstances where you simply can't do in-person studies, online studies are the only way to go. So Sugandha will give you a tutorial overview of how to go about using this platform. Thank you very much for doing this, Sugandha. I'll turn it over to you.
Sure, thanks. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. All right, can you see my mouse? I just want to make sure.
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so as Pawan mentioned, we'll be covering MTurk today. And so just a quick recap. So we know that these are the main components of the projects you'll be doing, right? One is you will be building some kind of model, which might be a deep net, and you also would be doing some human behavioral study, and then sort of comparing the performance of the network to what you see in humans. And last time we covered PsychoPy, and today we are going to cover Amazon Mechanical Turk. These are just two different interfaces which we can use to collect data from subjects when doing human behavioral studies. And so we can start with what is MTurk. And I'm just gonna start with this, with where the name came from. So basically, MTurk actually came from this machine which was supposed to be designed for playing chess. So the idea was that in 1700s, actually, the idea was to automate chess such that you could play with an automated system. And this mechanical machine was designed. And that's where the name Mechanical Turk comes from. But it actually turned out that this machine wasn't really automated after all. And there was actually, a person sitting in this box under the chess table who was actually controlling how the pieces on the board moved. So that's a little story about where Mechanical Turk came from. But in general, MTurk is a web service offered by Amazon for collecting data from human participants. It is partially interactive. It has some very nice integrated tools that you can use to design your experiments. So for instance, ability to add labels to images, or ability to segment images, or draw bounding boxes around images, and things like that. And it's a paid service. So when we are collecting data from human participants, we also pay them according to how much time they're spending doing our experiments. And so for the purpose of this class, each group would be given $75 worth of credits. And you can use those credits either when you're doing experiments on MTurk or through PsychoPy. And if you're doing experiments through MTurk, we've decided to have a single account for the whole lab, so that that account is preloaded with money. So you don't have to pay out of your pockets. And in that instance, then you can use that account to collect data and design your experiments. However, if you choose to use PsychoPy, then it's difficult to have a single account. So you would have to design your own experiments separately in separate PsychoPy interfaces. And then you can pay the participants yourselves and get reimbursed uh, till up to $75. So that's how we will be handling finances. Okay, so moving back to MTurk, there are two ways to do experiments using MTurk. One is to use MTurk's integrated tools to design your experiment. And some of the kinds of experiments that you can design include a survey questionnaire, or some experiments where you can upload images and ask people to classify images by providing labels or tag images. Or you can also ask people to draw bounding boxes around images that you specify. And then there's also options for adding audio and video and doing experiments which include audio and video. For instance, you might want to ask how natural a particular audio clip sounds, or how natural a particular scene looks when you're looking at synthetic versus natural scenes, synthetically generated scenes versus natural scenes. So the other way to do experiments using MTurk is where you design your experiment externally, but you use MTurk just to collect data, right? So in this instance, you have usually an external experiment, which could be an external survey, for instance, a Google form, or it could be another something like a virtual 3D game hosted on web, which you might use to study, for example, navigation or exploration strategies that people might use in an environment. And so the idea is that when you're doing designing experiments externally, you usually have a link to your experiment, and this link can point to a survey, or it can point to another kind of experiment where maybe you have a 3D environment, or you have a 2D grid, and you have a certain task, and you want to study a particular question. So in that case, you just provide a link to the MTurk, and what you're getting in return is the human subjects, right? So basically, instead of using MTurk to design your experiments, you design your experiments externally. You provide the link on the MTurk interface, and then you can just use the MTurk interface to collect data. So basically, the difference between these two options is just here you design, in the first option, you design your experiment on MTurk, and you also use MTurk to collect data. In the second option, you design your experiment externally, but you use MTurk to collect data still. So those are the two the designs that we will go through today, and we'll go through examples of each of them. But first, let's look at some basic terminology that's used in MTurk. And so the first thing is the requester. Requester is a person requesting work. So in our case, we'll be the requesters. The person who's designing the experiment, who's conducting the experiment, is a requester, and they're requesting work out of the subjects, right? The worker is the person who completes jobs. So once we post our experiments on MTurk, there'll be human subjects who will be doing our experiments, and they are called workers. And so they can actually select what experiments they will be doing based on different factors. For instance, how much they're paid, what are the reviews of previous experiments published by a certain lab, and so on, right? So they have this forum, which we'll also look at, where all the experiments are published, and they get to choose which experiments they would like to participate in. So when doing experiments, if you're a requester, you create a requester account on Amazon. And if you are a worker, you create a worker account on MTurk. And you can create either of those by going to mturk.com. And then there's also this very important terminology called HIT, Human Intelligence Task. So in short, we just refer to it as HIT. And the definition of a HIT varies depending on whether we're talking about option 1 experiments or option 2 experiments, right? So for option 1 experiments, where our experiment is designed using the integrated tools in MTurk, each task or question that we ask of the worker to complete is usually a separate hit, right? So for instance, If you are doing an image classification task, then if you have 10 images and you're asking subjects to classify these 10 images, then each of this image is called a hit. And a given batch will contain multiple hits, right? So in our case, a given batch will contain 10 hits. And you can actually publish multiple batches. So if I was doing a pilot experiment, I could publish one batch, but then later on I might decide to collect more data and I might publish another batch and so on. And we'll see how to do that. The second definition of hit is when the experiment is external. If I'm just designing my experiment externally and I'm just providing a link to MTurk to collect data, then that whole experiment is one hit. So I might be asking multiple questions in that experiment, but in that case, the whole experiment is defined to be one hit. The other important thing is assignment. So basically, by assignment, we mean how many number of subjects we want to perform our experiment, right? So if you look at the published number of jobs or hits, then you can put a limit on how many number of workers you want should complete your hit, right? So in this case, for instance, let's say I have a hit or a batch. Let's say I'm talking about the first kind of experiment here. So I have a batch which has 10 hits, and I can assign 5 workers, for instance. I can say that I want data from 5 subjects. So this will be one assignment, but the number of workers I assign would be 5. So the next thing which is very important is the sandbox accounts. So here, basically, these are testing environments which MTurk provides for building and testing experiments, and it's free of cost. So in this case, what you can do is, again, as we talked about before, there's a requester account and there's a worker account on mturk.com. But if you want to just try out an experiment, so you just want to design an experiment and try it out before you actually publish and release it for subjects to participate, then you can use these requester sandbox account. And also analogously, we also have worker sandbox account. So what this does is it helps you, the requester sandbox account helps you to design an experiment, and you can publish an experiment and see how that whole process of publishing works. And the worker sandbox allows you to go and pretend to be as a worker and look at the experiment which you published as a worker, so that you can see it from the worker's perspective, what it's going to look like to the worker. And so this gives you an idea of whether you have any bugs in your experiment, whether there's something you would like to correct, and whether it would be clear to the worker what you're asking of them. And so do people have questions so far? Okay.
Sugandha, maybe mention how the rates for the workers are being set. So how do you decide how much money to pay the workers?
Right. I'll be covering that
Okay,
in subsequent slides.
sure.
So what we can do now is we can all do this together. We can go to this URL and create a sandbox requester account. So let's all actually, let me stop sharing my screen and let me actually maybe share this link in the chat. So I'm going to request everyone to just go to this link and create an account for yourself so that we can try to create a sample experiment and see how that works. So if you've created the account, then give me a thumbs up reaction so that I can know how many of you are done with it. Okay, many people are done.
I think you're on mute.
Okay, yes, sorry. All right, so what I was saying was that if you go to Create tab and you click on New Project, then you will see a list of all the different experiment templates that are provided to you. And there's also this survey link option, right? So the first kind of projects which we talked about were using some of these integrated tools where we can design the experiment using some of these integrated tools. And the second kind of experiment we talked about was an external link, which is designed using the survey link option. So what we can do now is, you can see if you click on some of these, it shows you a simple template of an experiment. So for instance, this is the image classification one. And you can see that, there's an image displayed and there are certain labels. And you can change these labels if you want. And you can change the images, but this is the kind of the template, one kind of template that's provided. Another kind of template is this bounding box template, right? So what we can do is we can use this template to create a project. So let's see, let me move this window here. All right, so if you click on bounding box and then you click on create project, that takes you to this interface where you have to specify some details about your project. And this is where we are basically specifying the title, the description, how much we'll be paying the workers, whether there are any restrictions on what workers we want should be doing our experiments. So for instance, so the first option is project name, and this is just project name for myself. So this project name will not be visible to the subjects. This title, however, is going to be visible to subjects, right? So here the section is describing your task to workers. So this whole section will be visible to subjects. And so we can, give some description, for instance, bounding box game or something like that, right? Some title. Then we can also give some descriptions that in this experiment, or since I called it a game, I can also say in this game, your task would be to draw bounding boxes around the requested items, right? And this description can be 2 or 3 lines even. So then we also have these keywords, right? And so these keywords are supposed to help the workers or subjects to search for experiments they're interested in, right? So there's a keyword like bounding box. We can also say something like cognitive science, right? Vision. So if there are subjects who are particularly interested in experiments related to vision, then they'll be more likely to find our experiment by searching for some of these keywords. The next thing is setting up your task. So this is a very important thing here, the reward per assignment, right? So this means how much are we going to pay the subjects? And so in our case, since this is a bounding box experiment, and people be shown images and they have to create bounding boxes around images, then we really expect them to be spending maybe around 10 seconds on a single image. So in this case, this reward would be per image, right? Because we know that if we have a section of 10 images, then each of those images is a hit. And so this reward is per hit. So here, for instance, I can say 50 cents. So what's very important is that when you're specifying reward per assignment, you should really be looking at the minimum wage of the area that you're in, right? So for instance, if we are in US, we can just look at the minimum wage in the US. And I think the federal minimum wage in the US is around $8 per hour. And in the Massachusetts, it's a bit higher, around $12 per hour. And so when you are specifying the reward per assignment, you should think about how much time it will take for them to do one hit in your experiment, which means how much time it will take for them to label one image, or to whatever your task is, to perform the task on one image. And if it's going to take X amount of time, then you want to calculate the reward per assignment based on the minimum wage, right? So if it's $8 per hour and it's taking you only 10 seconds, and you want to specify the amount such that it's compatible with the minimum wage. So here I'm specifying 50 cents with an assumption that it will only take a couple seconds for them to do one image. So then we have number of assignments per task, right? So this is basically how many workers I want, or how many subjects I want for my experiment. So usually it's advisable to do a shorter batch first, and then do another batch later on, so that you can see if there are any bugs, etc. But since we are in Requester Sandbox, this already gives you an interface where you can test your experiment yourself and look at the bugs yourself. So let's say I just say I want 5 subjects, and then there's this option of time allotted per assignment. So this is basically the maximum time a worker has to complete your task, right? And so I usually just give a high number here. So let's keep it 1 hour, because even though I'm paying them by what the time I expect them to take to finish this, but I don't want to rush them also, right, while they're doing my experiment, unless my experiment has some temporal contingencies, right? So in this case, I leave it at 1 hour. And then there's this task expires in. So basically, this is the time frame for which your task will be visible on the Amazon's workers account, so that the people can find it and do it, right? So I'm saying that, okay, let my task expire in 7 days, because I expect that I will get 5 workers within 7 days. You can also increase this time frame if you think that it might take more. There's no harm of having a high value here. And then we have this option of how the workers will be paid. So usually there's this process of approval. So once workers have done your task, then you usually approve those workers. And what this option is suggesting is that, do we want the system to auto approve and pay the workers using the funds in our account, right? And so in this case, I usually like to leave it at 3 days. So basically, after the experiment, I don't have to go and manually approve all the workers unless I find someone who I don't want to approve, right? And in that case, I have 3 days to figure out if I don't want to approve a certain person, which rarely happens. So what this means is that after a particular subject has done the experiment, after 3 days, they'll be automatically approved and paid. So then we have worker requirements. Here we can specify any constraints we want for experiment, right? So for instance, if I want a certain constraint, for instance, one common one which people usually use is hit approval rate. This is basically how many times or how often is there hits getting approved by the requester. So If a worker is very good at doing experiments, they do them very attentively, then most of the experiments that they have participated in get approved by the requesters. And so what I want, if I want good attentive workers for my task, then I can specify that I want workers with a hit approval rate of greater than, say, 90%, right? Because everyone makes errors. So maybe it's not, we won't put it as 100%, but we can put it around 90, 95, whatever we prefer. Then we can also add, for instance, something else, like, let's say, location. I might want, I might want want to do an experiment on people of certain population, or maybe I don't want to constrain it, right? So in this case, let's just say I'm looking at populations of people within the United States, right? And then task visibility, we want it to be public so that all workers can see those tasks and participate. One thing that I want to point out is with regards to pay, since we are in the Sandbox account, it won't actually pay any workers, right? But when you are in the actual MTurk requester account, which looks exactly the same as this, the only difference is that there's no pay in the Sandbox account, whereas in the requester account, the workers will actually be paid from the funds in the account. So you don't have to worry about paying when you're just experimenting with designing your experiment. So then we clicked on design layout, and what
And
we
just one point, I want to reiterate the principle that you outlined in terms of payment, and I'm perseverating on the payment a little, just to make sure that people know how to budget their $75. So the minimum pay idea that Sugandha mentioned is a very good one. And what that translates to, say, for a hit that might take a few seconds, is a few cents per image. Because, say, at $8 per hour, we're talking about a quarter cent per second. That's the payment. So as Sugandha mentioned, if a hit, say a bounding box task, is taking a subject on average 10 seconds, so you should be setting aside, say, about 2.5 to 5 cents per hit. And by doing that, your outlay per subject is a reasonable amount, and you can collect data from many subjects without exceeding the $75 budget.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So just to summarize, basically what we're saying is that because most of our tasks would be image based and each hit is going to take only a couple seconds, so $75 budget is actually a lot, and you can get probably hundreds of subjects within $75. So, okay, so once we filled out the details of the form of the project, now we clicked on the design layout option, and we are in the design layout. And this is the JavaScript code. And basically, you can see that, there are these, especially this section, which is important, which shows your source image URL. There are labels, right? So here the labels are cat, dog, bird. And this is the place which allows you to embed different images. So in this case, what I want you to do is basically take this URL, and just for the sake of visualizing one hit, we'll just replace this image URL by this URL. And what this will do is this will fetch the image, which is at this particular URL. And so what we can do is we can preview this and see what it looks like. So we can see that it fetched this image of two birds. And then we can click on finish. And that basically created our project, right? So now our project has one hit with one image, and it shows up here, right? So basically we are still under the create tab, and the new project which we created now is showing up here. And if we want to now publish this experiment, so right now we are done with designing it. Now we want to publish it so that workers can see it, right? So then we can click on publish batch, and then this will show us what our experiment looks like. Again, we can click on next. That shows us a summary of all the details that we provided for the experiment. So there is the title which we specified, the description, how long the batch is active for, um, how long after the experiment is done will the workers be paid, and so on, and the restrictions, the constraints we imposed on the kinds of workers we're looking for. You'll see that here we only have one hit, so that's shown here, and we asked for 5 participants, so the total number of assignments is 5. If we have multiple images, let's say we had 10 images, then this would be 50 assignments. And here Amazon has also automatically computed the total amount, right? So one important thing is that you have to make sure that your remaining balance is always 0, so that you ensure that there are funds in the MTurk account, right? For requesters, or sorry, for workers to be automatically paid. And there's also this additional fee which goes to Mechanical Turk. Usually, if your batch size is less than 10, then the commission which Amazon takes is around 5%. But if your batch size is greater than 10, then usually it becomes 20%. So that's also one reason you might want to publish in smaller batches. And so now we've seen all the description, what we're paying, what the experiment looks like. So we can hit publish. Oh, what happened? Did it just sign me out? Okay, so let's see whether it was published. It didn't really get published, so I'm going to go back and publish it again because something weird happened. Usually when you publish it, your published experiments should show up under the manage tab, right? So you see that it automatically, once I published it, automatically switched me to my manage tab. So under create, I can see the list of all the experiments that I've designed. And once I publish them, they will show up under the manage tab. And I can then click on the manage tab button, and then I can look at the details of what the status of my experiment is, right? So this will show how many subjects have done it. So I've asked for 5 subjects, and this will show usually how many subjects have completed it so far, so that I get an idea. And there's also this results tab, which shows results, and which we'll look at a bit later. But yeah, so this is, and here we have the cost summary. So basically, this is what the requester account looks like. Do people have any questions so far about the requester account, the Sandbox requester? How many people were able to create this experiment? Okay, I see a few thumbs up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my slides and then just quickly go over what we just saw, and also a little bit of a complex version of it where we might have multiple images in a batch, right? Or multiple hits in a batch.
So Sugandha, one question I had was, for each of the images, one has to list it as a URL. You can't just have a local image repository and point to that local repository.
So my understanding is that you do need image URLs. And here we just specify the URL within the HTML code. But you can also have a CSV file which containing the list of all the URLs. And I'm going to go through it now, but you can also just use that CSV file to actually create a batch, give a batch of images rather than just one image. But I think you still need to have a bunch of URLs.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so okay, so just to reiterate, right? We saw that basically we have this interface and we have all these example templates available to us. And we went over this bounding box experiment and we created a hit with basically just one image in it, right? What and how did we do it? We clicked on the bounding box option in the left panel, and then we clicked on create project, and then that create project button took us to this edit project layout where we specified some of the details of the project. And since I showed you just an example with just one hit, now I'm going to show you an example which has multiple hits. And in this case, the task is for MTurk workers to identify the person who's closest or farthest from the ground. So we'll have labels for closest to the ground and farthest to the ground. And we'll give these images to workers, and they are supposed to draw bounding boxes around people who are closest and who are farthest, right? So then when we are in the design layout setup, then this panel setting up the task, we talked about how we are supposed to assign rewards, and we said that this reward is actually per hit, and you can maybe pay around 2 to 3 cents for each hit, right? Making sure that you're in compliance with the minimum wage. And so that means you'll get a couple hundred responses given your $75 budget. And then here we are specifying the number of assignments or number of workers we want that should complete our task. And then we can also, if we wanted, specify any constraints we want on the workers. And then we can click on the design layout. And that takes us to the design layout tab, which has our JavaScript HTML code. And so here in our example, what we did was we just replaced this URL with a single URL. But if you wanted to have multiple images in your batch, then you can have a CSV file where the column header should match this variable name, right? So basically, if we look at this variable name here, this variable name is actually image underscore URL. And so here I've specified image underscore URL as the header of the column. And then the rest of the rows in that column can contain different URLs of images. And so what we can do is we don't actually, in this case, edit this design layout at all. And we just create the project. So, okay, so this is just showing different images that are in my CSV file. But basically, in this case, what we do is we don't really change the design layout at all, but we specify the CSV when we are publishing this batch. So in this case, when you hit on publish, it will give you a prompt, which will ask you to choose the CSV file. And here you can select this button and upload the CSV file. And that will create a hit with multiple images. And so then you can basically also go back and preview your task. So basically, when you click on publish, it'll ask you to upload the CSV file. And once you have the CSV file uploaded, then it'll take you to a preview of your task. And so here, for instance, the task is basically, the person has to click for this from ground and then draw a bounding box around the person who is in the image furthest from ground. And then they have to click on closest to ground and draw a bounding box around the person who is closest to ground. One other important thing is that you can change the description here. So let me actually go back and show you how you can do that in the actual MTurk interface. So here, if I go back to edit, I can actually change any of the things I want to change about my experiment, right? In this case, I don't want to change anything here. But basically in my design layout, there are instructions, right? So you can provide any instructions you want here, right? So you can specify if you might have a different experiment, and so you might want to edit this sections to specify whatever instructions you might want to provide. And then when you preview them, you'll see that those instructions actually show up under here, right? So you can see there's draw boxes around the requested target of the interest. And in this case, you can even try doing that, right? So there's no cat, there's birds here, and here we can create these bounding boxes around these birds and submit. But the point is that in the design layout, you can also change the instructions depending on what tasks you're doing, right? And in the preview, you can actually do the experiment and submit just to see what kind of results you'll see once the experiment is done. And when I submitted it, it basically shows me the kind of output the experiment would generate. And this is basically showing me what label was provided, what are the dimensions of the bounding box. And since I've made two bounding boxes, there are two different sets here, right? One corresponding to the first bounding box and the other corresponding to the second bounding box. And both were labeled as bird in this case, right? So once you've once you've previewed them and seen the results, you can click on finish and that will get published and it will show up under your publish task under the manage tab. All right. So going back to the slides. So basically, in this case, this is a different task. It's very similar though. Here, again, just like we saw here, basically, we are labeling furthest from ground and closest to ground rather than labeling bird or cat or dog. And so you can see, similarly, you see the labels here, furthest from ground, closest to ground. In this case, there are two different labels. And then the dimensions, the height, left top and width of the bounding boxes here. So, and then of course, once you are going to publish, then before publishing, you are also shown the screen where you can make sure that all the things that you've specified are correct, specifically the number of workers you're asking for, and then also the amount that it's going to cost you. And you have to make sure that this should always be 0. And when you are just setting up your experiment, you should make sure that you're still in Sandbox, right? Because in Sandbox, the whole payment doesn't really matter. But when you're in the actual requester account, then the payment would matter. And then basically you want to make sure that your experiment works in Sandbox before you're actually going to the actual requester account to publish it. So, and then we saw the manage screen already. We saw that if you click on manage batches, you see a list of the tasks that you published. There's a progress meter, which will show you how many people have completed. There are a number of assignments shown. Then you also have to make sure to approve assignments so workers are paid, and that's very important. So once you see that you start seeing that this status is progressing, and once it's finished, you have to go to the results tab, and you can, if you haven't selected auto approve, then you have to go manually approve them. If you've selected auto approve, they'll automatically be approved within 3 days of they're doing the experiment. And then in this case, since we uploaded a CSV, so if you are uploading a CSV of different with URLs of different images, then your input CSV file is also shown on this page. So you have a record of what that experiment was and what stimuli you provided. So now what we can do is we can go to the worker sandbox account, and what we'll do is we'll just create a worker sandbox. So what you have to do is, let me share this link. And what we'll do is we'll go to the worker sandbox and just sign in there using the same login credentials that we have for our requester sandbox. So you can use the same login credentials and you can log into your account on this page. And I'll give you a few minutes to do that, and then we'll see what the worker interface looks like.
Sugandha, I regrettably have to break off for a search committee meeting, but thank you very much for doing this.
Sure.
Very clear and very helpful presentation.
Sure.
Yeah, so we'll be in touch next week.
Sure, see you.
See you.
Okay, give me a thumbs up if you've logged into the worker account. Okay, good. Many people have already logged in. So let's share my screen again. Okay, so this is what the worker account looks like. So you'll see that there's a list of all the hits which people have published. And so this is the worker sandbox account and not the actual sandbox. And so what we can do here is we can search for our own hit that we created, right? So you can search by either the name of the hit that you created or by your own name, right? So in my case, I'm just going to search by my name, and it shows me all the studies which have been published by me, right? So this is also useful that in case you are used to doing, you as a worker are used to doing experiments from a certain lab and you like doing their experiments because you're interested in the topics they're doing research on, then you can just search them by name, and it'll show you all the experiments listed by those labs. So in this case, this is the experiment that I just created. I called it bounding box game. So what I want you to do is also search for your own experiments and then click on accept and work. Right. So one thing that you can also notice that here it's also listed, the number of hits is listed and the reward per hit is listed. So for instance, in this case, the worker can see that there are 2 hits and the reward per hit is $1. So they'll get paid $2 if they do this. And usually if you click on this plus, there's also a description, right? It tells you how much time is allotted, when this will expire. In the description, usually you can also put that the experiment is expected to take this much amount of time, right? So you can say the experiment is expected to take 5 minutes of time, or 10 seconds per hit, something like that, right? So that people have an idea of how long they'll be taking to do the experiment and how much they're paid. And they can consider that when choosing to do your experiment. So, okay, so we will click on accept and work. And now we are pretending to be a worker, right? So there has been a study published, I'm pretending to be a worker, and this is how my experiment will look like to a worker. Again, I'm logged out for some reason. Okay, so clicking on accept and work showed me the study. I can look at the instructions and it says draw bounding boxes. It also shows the instructions on the top. I can also click on more instructions and there'll be some detailed instructions there. And again, you can also edit these detailed instructions in the design layout of the experiment when you're designing it. So now that I've seen the instructions, I know what to do, right? So in this instructions, it's clearly stated that you have to draw rectangles and you have to, use bounding boxes to draw rectangles around the targets or the labels. So here again, I will select bird. I think these are birds. So I'll make a bounding box as a worker. And then I think the other one is also a bird. So I select another bird label and then I make a bounding box. And then I will click on submit. And so I have been given this message that hit is submitted. There are no more hits available, right? So that's it, right? And in this case, I only had one image, but if there were multiple images, it would take me through all the images before giving me this message that my hit is completed. Okay, so that's basically the worker view. And I will just reiterate that very quickly using the slides. So what we just saw was that if we go to the worker sandbox, that we can see a list of the hits, right? And it gives us some details about, the reward, the number of hits in a particular batch. And you can click on accept and work to actually do the experiment as a worker. So again, one hit means one image or one question. And if you've specified the reward to be 50 cents, then it's 50 cents per hit, right? So if it's one hit, then they're paid 50 cents in total. Then you click on accept and work if you want to actually do the experiment. And what we didn't see, so what you can do now is actually go back to your requested Sandbox account and look at the manage tab and see whether you actually see any progress, right? It's possible that you might not see it yet because it takes a little bit of time for the two interfaces to update relative to each other. But as you can see here, I've come back. If I go to the manage tab and I come back to my bounding box experiment, then I can see that one assignment has been completed. How many people see their assignments completed? Give me a thumbs up if you see your assignment completed. Okay, few people are already seeing it. If you're not seeing it, give it a few minutes. Usually, sometimes it takes a little bit of time for them to sync. But what we can do now is, since we see this assignment is completed, we can go to results and we can look at this result. And you'll see that if you go to results, you see the worker ID, you see the hit ID, right? So the worker ID, every Amazon Mechanical Turk worker has a unique ID, which is meant to kind of anonymize them so that their name is not visible. But since they have a unique ID, it makes sure that one worker can only do one experiment once, right? So if you've published a batch, any given Amazon MTurk worker with a given worker ID can only do it once. So you don't have duplicate subjects. And here you can see that, apart from the worker ID and hit ID, you also have their approval ratings. This is the result of what they labeled when they did their experiment. And these are some height and width properties. So what you can do once you have this view is just click on download CSV. And what that does is it just downloads all the results. And you don't want to do it immediately when you have one result. You can, if you just want to look at the results and kind of see whether you can analyze them. But usually once you have all the results, you'll download them. Or maybe when you have half the results, you can download them. One thing to keep in mind is that once you hit this download CSV once, you will be taken to the next page, and then you have to click it here again, right? And only then it will download this CSV. But you can only do this, I think, once in every hour. So if you've done it once, now that I've downloaded it, I can't. There's some period of time for which I can't download again if the participants are still working on this hit, right? So let's go back to the slides. And so basically, just to reiterate what we were just seeing, sorry. So basically we went to our worker account, right? And we've tested it, and then we came back to our Sandbox requester account, and we saw that there's one subject who's completed it, and of course that one subject was me myself in this case. And so now what we did was we clicked on results, and when we clicked on results, one thing I forgot to show you was how to approve actually. But basically, when you click on results, it will take you to this results view, where if you don't see anything, that means either the results are not in, which you should have seen in the status bar, or there's some filters, right? So you can, if you click on the filter results button, you'll see that you can set the filters to submitted, approved, or rejected, so that it lists all the ones that are either approved or submitted or rejected, right? So usually you want to look at all the ones that are approved, but you can also just remove the filter just to see all the results that have come in, right? If you want to see all the submitted results, you can just select submitted here and you'll see all the submitted results. And you can actually, there are checkboxes on the left of these, which you can click and hit approve if you want to manually approve. Usually I would recommend to just set auto approve when you're designing your tasks, so that they automatically get approved within 3 days of the task being completed by the workers. So here I'm just showing you again what different labels in this results view mean. So you can see in this case, this example is again going back to the example where we had 5 images in a file, in a CSV file that we uploaded, right? So if we had 5 images, then you will see that for the same worker ID, there'll be 5 different hit IDs, right? And this is because we know that every image in a given batch is a separate hit. But if we have 10 images in a batch, the same subject or the same worker will go through all the 10 images, right? So you'll see the same worker ID for all those 10 or 5 images, right? And then you might have different worker IDs again for the same 5 hit IDs and so on, right? And again, you see one worker ID here because only one person completed the task in this case. And then you see, so this is also important. So you also see image URLs, right? So because in this case you have different hits, you actually have multiple images. And so you can see that the image corresponding to which these results are in the image URL field. So you can actually know which image was labeled as furthest from ground, etc. And so one thing that I should also mention is that this format, which we see here, is actually called the JSON format. And you can basically write your own, your own JSON parser if you want to parse these results, right, from the CSVs that you download. So when we click on download CSV, so which is basically this download CSV button, then it takes us to the next page where you have to click again to download your batch. And if you open this in Excel, you will see the same, all the same fields laid out in Excel, and even some extra fields. So, all right. Right. So here's an example of the kind of response from the bounding box experiment. So as we saw before, right, there is a label and there are dimensions of the bounding box, and this is corresponding to the bounding box 1. But then there's another bounding box because there were 2 bounding boxes, closest and farthest from the ground. So in this case, you have another bounding box which has the label for the closest to the ground and the dimensions. And so again, this is called the JSON format, and you can either manually extract these values, or you can find a JSON parser somewhere online or code it up yourself so that you can parse this data to collect all the information that you want. So before I go to the external experiment, I want to slightly pause and ask if there are any questions. How many people feel like they understood how they can use the sandbox to either create, or the requester sandbox to create an experiment, and the worker sandbox to test out the experiment? Give me a thumbs up if you feel like you've understood how to do that. Okay, good. Seems like most people got it. So then we can move on to the next part, which is basically looking at the second kind of experiments. So we talked about one kind of experiments where we can use the integrated Amazon tools, and then another kind of experiments where we can just have an external survey link, right? So this is very similar to what we just saw, except in this case, we can click on survey link and then design our experiment, right? So this survey link can be anything usually. So for instance, you could have Google Forms, right? And you can also, by the way, you can also design surveys even using the integrated MTurk interface, right? But if you want to work with an external survey, or it doesn't really have to be a survey, it can be any experiment which MTurk doesn't allow you to design and you want to design externally, then you can use the survey link option. And so one example of a survey link would be Google Forms. Maybe you feel like handling the data from Google Forms is just easier for you, then you can use the survey link option. And here's a very nice blog post which gives you a run through of how to use a survey link and what are the important things that you should keep in mind. So what I want to point out is that there are 2 very important things if you're using the survey link option. One is that you want to ask for their worker ID, right? So just to make sure that when you're approving workers in the results section, you know that the person you're paying is a legit worker who actually did your experiment. So you can ask, you make sure that you have a worker ID field. But even more important than worker ID, because sometimes you'll actually in Amazon, you might also automatically get the worker IDs, as we saw in the results section, right? The worker IDs automatically show up. So we go back. The worker ID actually automatically shows up, but it's still a good practice. If possible, you can include it in the form as well. But what's even more important is, this confirmation message. So in the Google form, if you go, when you're designing a Google form, if you go under presentation, you can see a confirmation message that is usually displayed to the participants at the end of the Google form. After they hit submit, they're shown this confirmation message. This is important because here you can give them a unique code. So maybe you're doing a vision classification experiment and you can give them VIS class or something like that, anything which is specific to your experiment. And you can ask them to enter that as their completion code in MTurk. So if you look at the survey link option, you'll see that there's this region which asks you to provide the survey code. And this is where they'll enter this code, right? Here they've given an example of numbers, but you can also give text, right? Just like they've given a text here, complete 3T3. So basically this is the location where they'll enter the survey code. And this is to ensure that, they're legitimate people who are doing it and there's no duplication of workers. So another important thing is that if you have in most of the CSV that you download from either MTurk or even from an external survey link like a Google form, if you have a field called worker ID, then you just want to make sure that you're not publicizing that data or putting it online somewhere. And if you want to, the data is completely anonymous except for the worker ID, because even the worker ID is kind of hidden, it still corresponds in the background to some unique person. So you want to just make sure that you remove the worker ID column before you actually share data with anyone or publish it anywhere. So let's actually just let me just quickly show you how to create this kind of a let's see, let me share. So, I shared the wrong desktop. Let's share the first one. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly show you how we can create. So again, right now I'm in my requester sandbox. I click on create, and then I can click on new project. And here I'm given this survey link, right? I click on the survey link, and there are some instructions that I can read, and I can basically, this is not my survey. If I want to create this project, I'll click on create project. And I'm just going to quickly go through this. This is very similar to what we saw before. Okay, so in the design layout, what's important is that here I want to replace this survey link with my own survey link, right? So this is my own survey link here. And then what I can also do is I can change these instructions, right? So if I want, there are instructions here. We are conducting an academic survey about social networks. I can say we are conducting a survey about, I don't know, spatial navigation or something like that, right? Whatever you want it to be, depending on what your study is, you can change this description. So that changed the description from social networks to spatial navigation. So you can make these edits by clicking on the source button. And then once you've provided the survey link, you don't have to provide the survey code because this is meant for the workers to provide. So you can preview your task and you see that this is what the workers will see, right? They'll see these instructions and then they'll see the survey link. They'll click on the survey link and they'll do your survey and then they can provide the survey code here, right? So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to finish this. And now I go back and look at this, under my create tab, the survey link shows up. So I can now click on publish batch. And this is again very similar. Again, it shows you a preview of what workers will be seeing. And then you can click on next. It'll give you the summary, and then you can click on publish. And that has published. And under the manage tab, now you can look at the survey link 4. So given this, if I now go to yes, so if I go to my workers sandbox, I can see that this survey has shown up, right? And I can again, click on accept and work, and it'll show me this, right? So it gives me this link, and now in this case, what the worker has to do is just take this link and take this URL and paste this URL here, right? So in this case, this link was pointing to some form, and they'll fill out the form, submit it. And once they submit, they'll be given a completion code. And once they have the completion code, then they can basically go back and write the completion code. Let's say it's just this, right? So I can then write the completion code and hit submit. And then I'm given the message that my hit is submitted. If they write the wrong completion code, then you know that they did not get to the end of your experiment. So that's the main motivation for having a completion code, right? Because otherwise, because you have an external link, there's no way to track whether they're actually reached the end of the experiment and they finished the experiment. So giving this completion code actually helps helps for you to figure out whether they actually completed the experiment or they just left in the middle. And you'll also see that from your data, but this is just another way of seeing whether they went to the end. So another example of an external link. So we just saw how a Google form would work, but that link could also point to something else. For instance, it might be a 3D virtual environment, which is an experiment designed like a game. And what the experimenter might have done. So for instance, in my work, what I do is I have this 3D virtual environment, which I host on web, and I collect my data instead. So in a Google form, you just collect the data in the Google Drive. But if I have a 3D game like environment, then I can set up my own server and collect the data using PHP on a PHP enabled server. And in this spatial navigation 3D virtual environment, what I do is I just collect data like trajectories, for instance, the XY positions and the orientation of the agent or the subject, right? So I want to see what trajectories in this 3D world did they take, where did they go first, and what decisions did they make while going through this 3D maze. So if that's not making much sense, I'll just show you a quick demo. So this is what my experiment looks like, right? So the URL which I provide in my experiment actually links to this web page, right? To a web page which basically shows them this interface. So you can see here, I've provided explicit instructions in addition to the instructions on MTurk, right? So I've said, okay, welcome to our study. I've given them the expected amount of time the study is going to take. And then I have kind of being polite, thanked them for participating because, they are providing us very valuable data for research. And then I also put some more information about, assuring them that their anonymity is assured, because this is an external link, right? So people can be a little hesitant with external links about their anonymity. So here we can explicitly state that, your anonymity is assured. And that you are basically consenting to participate in this study. So in this case, what happens is that on the initial page, I'm asking for their age and gender. I just ask for this information in case it's useful later. So the person adds that, and I just want to pause here. So I give these instructions, right? And this is now the instructions to do the task. So for instance, in here I've said, in this study, you look for diamonds hidden in a maze, and you have to use the keyboard keys to move and mouse to turn and look around. And you should find all diamonds in the environment as quickly as you can. And as soon as you find all diamonds, the experiment will advance to the next maze. And they've been told that we'll begin with 5 practice mazes. So usually when you're designing experiments, sometimes it's also customary for a complex experiment design to have some practice stimuli so that you give some training and some getting used to people, to the subjects. And once they know the task well after practicing, then they can just, you can have test stimuli where you actually collect data that you will look at. The practice stimuli, practice data, you still will look at, but you wouldn't usually take that into account in your analysis. So let's see. So once they've read the instructions, they are looking at the first practice stimuli. So practice 1 out of 5. There's a timer telling them that they only have a limited amount of time in any environment. And there's also a diamond counter here, which shows how many diamonds they've collected in this particular stimuli, right? So since they're in practice 2 out of 5, they haven't collected any diamond. Now they just collected 1 diamond. So we saw the counter go up. And then they go towards the other diamond, and once they collect the diamond, the counter goes up, and you see basically once I just want to pause and show you the screen. So they're also given in this case some feedback, right? That your level is complete, you found 2 out of 2 diamonds. So they're given some feedback that they found all the diamonds, and then they can press a particular button P to continue on their keyboard. And so that's it, right? Basically they have a bunch of practice stimuli and so on. And another important thing here is that, yes, so basically after the practice stimuli, usually you have this kind of a quiz where you make sure that the person has actually understood the task. So you're saying, okay, you finished the practice stimuli, but please answer this quiz. And the quiz is asking them what their task is. So if they understand what their task is, then we can trust the performance on the test stimuli much better than otherwise, right? So in this case, the correct answer is B, right? Your task is to find as many diamonds in the environment as quickly as possible. And so they enter whatever they think their task is and hit done. And then they're presented with a bunch of test stimuli, which are also very similar mazes with different structures in them. And I wouldn't go through all of these, but what's important is at the end, in this case, they're said, okay, once they've completed all the test stimuli, they're shown this, they're given this feedback, that thank you, and they're asked for any feedback or comments they might have, right? So in this case, we're asking, do you have any feedback about the experiment, or do you notice any strategies that you were using? And the person says that I noticed that the environments had a repeating pattern, so I could adapt my strategies, right? And then they submit it. And so here's, in this case, what I'm doing is I'm just generating a random code. So in my case, this code is just randomized for every participant. But you don't have to do it like that. You can also just have a same code and assume that the participants are not really talking to each other. The random code just helps because sometimes and we'll talk about Turk review, but on the Turk review, sometimes they'll post reviews, and you don't want them to post your code in the review and others already know what the code is and they claim to have finished the experiment. Because once they're provided the completion code, you have to pay them, right? Even if they didn't finish the experiment. So if they somehow found out your completion code and they just didn't even do the experiment and submitted the completion code, then you are legally bound to pay them. So you can't reject them. So yeah, that's another example basically of having an external link and doing a fairly complicated experiment, which MTurk actually wouldn't allow you to design, right? I can't design this kind of a 3D layout within MTurk, but it still gives me a venue to collect data for my experiment. So I can just provide an external link and collect data. And in this case, the data is actually completely routed to my server. But there still will be a CSV file under results, which will show the worker ID and the hit ID. Okay. So just some few last points. There is this unique Turker website. And in this case, basically what we know is that if you have published a batch, then only one worker is allowed to do a given experiment. But if you now go and publish another batch, so let's say I now go back to my sandbox, right? And I go back to manage, and I go back to my bounding box. Actually, for publishing, we have to go to the create. So I go back to bounding box and I publish another batch, right? And now if I'm publishing another batch, then it's going to show up as a different option here, right? So there'll be two bounding box games. And so the point is that as a worker, I can do one of these options only once, but if there was another instance of bounding box game, another batch, then I am allowed to do it again. And sometimes we don't want that, right? So if I just publish this experiment again, I don't want people to be able to do this experiment again. And so for that, you can actually go to this link. And let me just quickly show you. So if you go to this link, you can see that this is just a website which provides a unique identifier which you can use to ensure that people are not allowed to do the same experiment twice, even if it's multiple batches. So if you click on get script, it gives you a script. And all you need to do is basically just go to the edit, go to the design layout and paste the script at the beginning of the design layout. And this is valid for survey link as well. Even in the survey link, we saw that there was a source option under design layout, which had all the JavaScript and HTML code. If you go and paste the script at the top of that HTML code, or in this case, at the top of the design layout, and then save it, and then we can preview it and publish it. So basically, before publishing, you can just add the script at the top. And you can try this out in your own time. And now you can see that if you publish multiple batches of this and go to the worker sandbox and try to do multiple batches, you won't be able to do them. You will only be able to do one batch, and it'll give you a message that you're not allowed to do these multiple batches. So I encourage you to just go and explore this option. And I think that's it. This is just Turk review. This is just a website. I won't go into it, but basically this is just a place where workers actually look for the reviews for different experiments. So if you go here and, for instance, if you are interested in looking at reviews of experiments from McDermott lab, you can type McDermott experiments, and then it'll show you, any reviews, right? It'll show you that how much they are being paid, how much the experiments published by McDermott lab pay participants, and how the participants are rating those experiments, whether they're safe, whether they're fun to work with, and so on, right? And so that's basically what I wanted to cover today. I think this is just reiterating that, once you have your CSV files from either MTurk or your Google form or in any external survey or external link, then you can just analyze them either in whatever way you like, right? If you have JSON data, you can write a JSON parser, or you can parse them by hand, or you can, automate whatever data you have depending on what's important for your experiment. What's also important is that when you're trying out the requester sandbox and the worker sandbox, you want to download the CSV file and analyze the CSV file, right? If you are a group of two, have both of you do the experiment, or maybe have some of your friends do them on worker sandbox, and try to analyze the data so that you know how you will be analyzing that data. Because sometimes what happens is that once you have collected the data, you realize later that that data is not going to be useful to you, or you don't know for sure how to analyze it. So make sure before you actually do your experiments, you already know what kind of data you're collecting and how you'll be analyzing them using the requester and worker sandbox accounts. So we're past time, so I'm just going to finish here.